Hello, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome you to our podcast, Becoming CEO. This is Angela Capello from Houston, Texas. You can call me Mac. And this is about coaching CEOs, becoming CEOs. And my co host is Dr. Elizabeth Coffey. She's the founder of Spark Leadership, an internationally recognized leadership expert. She has worked all over the world coaching executives, CEOs, CEO successors. And previously, she was a senior partner in Conferris Leadership, but she has done many things, including writing 3 books and receiving many accolades that include a honorary doctorate, the Woman Superachiever Award, Mentor of the Year, and the European Woman of Achievement Award. She is a cum laude graduate from Wellesley College and has a double degree in psychology and English literature. Her PhD is from the Rice University, and she hails from New York and has lived extensively in London and Mumbai, India. Liz?
Thank you so much, Mac. Yes, I am excited to be here with you to have the second of our podcasts on how to thrive in a foreign nation. Mac has a background and indeed a PhD in earth and environmental sciences. She has had the bulk of her career in the energy sector, but as she mentioned, that has been in a variety of countries. So first Venezuela, then Kuwait, and now indeed she's in the US. I have done the kind of opposite travels where I started out in New York and studied and then stayed in London. I spent 3 years in Germany and about a year ago moved to India. In the meantime, as she mentioned, I've worked extensively all over the world, helping leaders to be better at their jobs, and in particular, have kind of created a specialty in working with CEOs to make them better at their jobs and helping people transition into the CEO role. So the focus of our podcast is really on that latter bit, helping people become CEO and become better at being CEO. In the meantime, part of what we wanted to talk about with you today is the challenges that it requires to overcome when you're actually navigating a different national culture. And what does that require in terms of skills? Mac, do you want to kind of start us in on that
Sure.
topic?
And I think that today we are going to talk a lot about 2 things: courage and also humbleness. And you may be wondering why. I mean, these are two kind of opposite concepts, but as a matter of fact, they go together, especially in the coaching world and in the multiculturalism. So I was born in Caracas and in Venezuela. And the thing is that I was born into an Italian family. And from the beginning, I knew that something was kind of different in the way that things were done at home or, look at or decided at home versus what I saw happening at school. So what I learned to do from the very early age was to impersonate what was needed for the occasion. So I would be the perfect Italian at the Venezuelan Italian club, for example, or in Italian gatherings for baptisms or weddings. But I would be your perfect Venezuelan at salsa parties or other kind of gatherings and at work, where it was perhaps more important to be truly and completely adapted to the culture Venezuelan. So I think that helped me a lot in the journey because when I was kind of practically thrown out from my nest, which was in Venezuela, and landed in Kuwait, it was to face a completely different culture. And the first thing that I carried with me was that certainty that we are not always right and that there are plenty of ways to look at things, to do things, and to plan for activities and the future. That gave me that kind of strength and perhaps even courage to face what I thought was so different from my own vision, my own story at work and at life. And it was a discovery journey that was accompanied by a lot of humbleness from my side to accept from the Middle Eastern ways of being and socialize things that I thought would be unacceptable in my own Italian culture, for example, or what was considered educated to do, for example, giving the hand as a woman, right, was forbidden by not only cultural traditions, but even religion, if taken to an extreme. So this was something that made me think about.
By giving a hand, you're talking about shaking hands with somebody when you first meet them.
Yes,
Yes, I
yes.
think it's worth explaining that for people who have not experienced Muslim cultures at close range. Can you talk a little bit more about that element of it?
Sure. There are several things in the Middle East that you come to face almost immediately. And that happens, for example, when you get to meet somebody new and the automatic gesture is to extend your hand, to shake hands. But women will not shake hands with men or with other people unless they know them. So for me, it was kind of shocking to see that I would extend my hand to people, to men, and they would just not retribute or reciprocate the
Mm.
gesture. It was almost immediately that I faced, oh, what is happening here? And with my, perhaps using my Italian skills, I would smile and ask with genuine curiosity why they are not giving me the hands immediately to the other women accompanying me in the meeting. And they would tell me, we will explain later. Don't get offended. I said, I am not offended. I am just watching what is going on. And this is what they explained to me that women do not give hands and men do not give their, accept or give hands to women, shake hands, let's say in English. By the way, this is another example of lost in translation.
Indeed. So it's a good example of what we're talking about. And because you come from one culture and I come from another, it's useful that we've got both of us here to sort of understand it. So this is just an example. And I want to just sort of inject here something, which is a language used particularly by younger people today of how they describe this, which is code switching. This kind of idea that you've grown up in a particular kind of way of being, and then you're in a circumstance where you have to switch gears. Most people, when they're talking about this, are not talking about it in the context of moving from one national culture to another, like you and I are. But basically, it's the same activity where you have to basically be aware of yourself and what you're trying to do, aware of the other and what you are perceiving that they're doing, trying to understand that in the moment, and then adjust your behavior to actually make it work for what's going on, especially if we're in the other person's culture. So it's like, what's the majority? And are we the minority? Because if we're the minority, we have to kind of switch codes. So I wanted to kind of just mention here that Mac and I met actually in, well, first on a call, I think, and then in Kuwait, where she was living at the time and she was working internally within the largest of the energy companies there. And she was looking for people to work with the deputy CEOs and the CEOs of her company. So that's how we actually first got in contact with each other. And I was assigned originally 4 deputy CEOs, I think, and 1 CEO or something like that. And as I understand it, there was a total population of about 60 people who needed to get coaching. It was the first experience in Kuwait at the time. So it was kind of a novel experience for all of the people locally and for indeed all the people like me who are coming in. And so there was a lot of very interesting cross-cultural communication that was going on because all of the coaches, as I understand it, Mac, were from outside the country, including me. But I'm keen to understand, how did you even look for people to do this? What were the deciding factors? Because I know it was a massive project for you to find people that were going to be able to do this work effectively.
That was one of the most interesting projects that where I was faced with the need to pair coaches with coaches. And why this program came to be? Because as the promotion and the progression in the career of people, professionals from, senior professionals to team leaders, from team leaders to managers. So all the way until manager, basically the progression is based on what you may want to call technical abilities and knowledge, which are skills that can be learned in available courses and programs. The challenge was from manager to deputy CEO, and especially from deputy CEO to the top, which is CEO. And we are talking, this was before it was more common and there is like today, more availability of programs customized for executives and also for women into leadership. At these times, there were several organizations that offered training and coaching in leadership. But as per the culture in Kuwait, they wanted this kind of training to be, first of all, private, in the sense one to one coaching, because there was this secrecy that if somebody was in such a high rank, how come they needed to learn more? Because they were like already enthroned in a position that was so high that the very thought of having to place them to be trained or to be guided could be detrimental to their image, prestige, or even seniority, right? So that required a lot of internal conversations and agreement until I was very glad that they agreed into pursuing executive coaching by professionals. So I was advising several deputy CEOs at the time, and I was a trusted advisor for a variety of topics, including women empowerment and technical matters and the position, let's say the positioning, if you may, of that company into the international conferences where they have seen me in action, where coaching some of them to be panelists or to be exposed to these huge audiences, how to do it. So I was this kind of behind the scenes coach. So they assigned me the responsibility of pairing the coach with a particular two or three deputy CEOs who advised who I was supporting. I was given like 15 proposals, 10 to 15 proposals of executive coaches that were like freelance, or they have their own companies in leadership. And that is when the adventure started, because how can I was faced with this challenge. How can I pair these coaches with a person that has been educated, raised, and worked in Kuwait with not necessarily a huge exposure to other cultures or other styles of management? So what I did in the particular case of you, Liz, is that in your case, the deputy CEO at stakes was a woman. And as a female leader, she was very, very capable and very, very technical as well. And I would say that she had also a huge intuition for what is even, body language, the sense of the meetings, the ranking of the opportunities, and has such a pleasant manner of handling the meetings and the people that it was her success to do more. I mean, her success was the company's success. So who could further expand what she already had as a base? So in that particular case, what I did is to take note of the potential gaps of those three deputy CEOs that I was given versus the offerings of the executive coaches. And in you, I saw this multiculturalism, this exposure also to other sectors, including finance, the banking sector, energy, and others. That was an experience that was not only tied to oil and gas. But when you bring a person with a view of different styles, with different stories of leadership, that is what was needed to potentially accelerate her expansion into an international arena, if you may, and if that was even possible to further expand the ability she already had to communicate business objectives and also achieve and enhance the success of the company with all kind of stakeholders at very high level. So I thought that, first of all, that coach had to be a woman so that this female leader could open up to the same gender because of cultural reasons. Secondly, it had to be of a similar age so that she could also trust of some relatable family situations and related to parents and children that were similar, and also a person that perhaps preferentially should come from the UK or the United States for the simple fact that those two countries are revered in many regions of the world, not only the Middle East, also Latin America, as owners of technology, advances, and leadership in their own, globally, let's say, in their own global ranks or scale or league, in their own league. So these were basically the major elements that I consider. And I will tell you a secret. I noticed that there was a reluctancy of all the three deputy CEOs in being vocal in social media. And not all the coaches had a presence on LinkedIn, on Instagram, or Twitter. But you had that kind of courage and ability to position yourself on social media. And I thought that kind of skills were also needed for this kind of leadership. So now you know the secrets that are inner process.
Indeed. So I think for me, when I kind of think about that period, and I believe that I had, if I remember correctly, I think I started out with six deputy CEOs, and I think there was one actual CEO in the middle of all of that. But so she was one of them, but there were these others that I was working with as well who were men. But over time, some of the 10 coaches that you had brought in to work with the variety of people were not able to actually transition and make that partnership work. So in fact, I got more. I got four more people. So in the end, I had 10 different people that I was working with in that project that went on for, I believe, 2 years. It was the first project of its kind in the country. And so it was a very big experiment, very big piece of innovation for the organization, which you really brought in, and that I was a kind of one of the people who was kind of along for the ride with you on that. So one of the things I would say in terms of my own experiences during that period of time was, first of all, it was incredibly enjoyable to me because I am curious, and we both know that curiosity is one of the critical things that makes you successful if you actually want to move to a different national culture and make it work. So I was curious about Kuwait. I had not been there before, and so coming there each month to have these meetings was fascinating to me. And the people who were hosting me were incredibly generous. They were proud of their culture. They wanted to show me the country. I was given all sorts of access to, going out to see the desert and having kind of special experiences. So I had an incredible time while I was there. And there were certain elements of it that were particularly unusual and interesting for me and a big learning as I went along. One of the things that you have not mentioned, but I'm going to mention from my own perspective, is that we're both aware that in that culture, it's a dry culture. So there's no alcohol allowed to be served in the whole of Kuwait. And for me, that's not a problem because I don't drink alcohol anyway. But for a lot of expats, it's a problem. And the local customs people are used to the idea that when expats come back in from out of the country, they try to smuggle in alcohol. So at this point, I was coming in with a big bottle of liquid vitamins, kind of a green vitamins, like it looked super healthy, but it was large. It was, kind of like the size of an alcohol bottle. And I was stopped at customs and asked to kind of show people my bags. And by that point, I knew what they were going to be looking for. So I said, you're not going to find what you're looking for. That, the bottle that's in here that has liquid in it is vitamins. And so they, of course, they didn't believe me. So we kind of like rifled through my stuff and I got the bottle and then I kind of showed them what it was. And it was kind of clearly, and I said, listen, I'm happy to open this up and for you to try it if you want to, because it's like green liquid vitamin. So I had that kind of experience, which was kind of amusing. But one of the other things that was very interesting to me was that at this stage, it was pre-COVID, but at this stage, people were beginning to use online meetings as a way to kind of reduce travel and so on, reduce costs of travel as well as the time of travel, etc. And I was used to doing that from various clients who were in different countries. But basically, I had nobody in the whole group that actually would do that. And so what it meant was for me, I had to actually go there every month. Now, I'm happy to do that because for me, it's part of the adventure, it's part of my learning, it's part of the experience. So even though it's time consuming for me to do that, I always found it really interesting. I wanted to just say one more thing about this in terms of things that I learned. I learned many things about the company itself, but they're confidential, so I won't actually talk about that piece of it. But one of the interesting things was that one of the gentlemen that I was actually working with was a member of the royal family, and he and I got on very well in our sessions. And at one point, he invited me to have a meal with him. I think it was lunch. And so we went out to a local restaurant. And of course, part of this was him showing off his country and the restaurants and so on, because of course, Kuwait was very developed and had wonderful food and so on. But we ended up going out with not just him and me, but actually sort of like three other random men. And I was curious because this had never happened to me before. I didn't really understand what was happening in the beginning because the men were not really contributing to the conversation. They were eating the food, but it was basically him and me who were talking. So I thought, what's going on here? And it took me some time to unpick what that was. But basically, I realized two things were happening. One, men are not supposed to be out with somebody who's female, who's not their wife in public. So that was a problem on their own. And secondly, he's a member of the royal family. So people are going to be interested in possibly take photographs of him out with other people. So he had other people around us so that it looked like it was a broader meeting. And he wasn't out with another woman. He was out in a group having a meeting. So that was a really interesting learning experience for me because I I just walked into it not really knowing what it was, and it took me some time afterwards to sort of unpick what was actually going on.
Yes, you had not shared that anecdote with me, and I was while you were telling that, I was like, "What? How did that happen?" Because I mean, I knew that that would not have happened. Like you going out with any of. It doesn't have to be the royal family. It could be any other of the DCOs or managers alone for a lunch. Impossible. So that brings me also to the other comment that in the Middle East, the networking efforts of women in leadership positions are very hampered, curtailed, challenged by the fact that they socialize among themselves, among the women, more readily than men. Men go every week, they have a diwaniyah, which is like a meeting where all the men and only men attend. And these are large meetings, very informal and very full of food and very nice, in which not necessarily, but it is the perfect broth for decision making, right? When they are all together, etc. And as women are not there, it's logical to think that perhaps that could or challenge or interfere or perhaps also influence decisions that should be only of corporate nature. But the thing is that networking is everything. And we know that in the US, in the UK, in Europe. I mean, networking is very important. The thing is that how you network in the Middle East is a little bit different because of cultural restraints that still apply to men and women from our point of view, which is also important to consider because we can notice the difference. It's not something that we are making it up, it's something that we can compare with doing networking in Houston versus doing networking in Kuwait City.
Indeed. And I have a story of something that I heard actually from another person who was an internal functional lead like you, who was female, who talked to me about that because I was saying, how do you influence people in this decision making body? It's a very large organization. There are some very senior people. Some of them are royals, some of them are not. But it's a lot of people involved in decision making at the very top. And some of them are quite hard to reach, so to speak. So I was saying to her, how do you influence? And she said, well, I can influence directly in a one-to-one situation at work when when we're 9 to 5, if you will, kind of in the working hours. But after that, I have to prep my husband because he's going to about 3 of these divaniyas per week with men, other men, and I need for him to be positioning certain things that are important to me with each one of those groups and different groups of people in those groups. So I can't be involved in that, but I have him going and representing me and my perspective on this to try to nudge things along in the direction that I want. So that was a really interesting piece of information for me that I had never thought about before, but I thought, okay, this is very, very interesting. Another thing I wanted to talk about from a cultural difference point of view happened not to me in Kuwait, but rather in the UAE. And this is about respect for the national dress. So I was working there in the largest of the companies, which is again a nationally owned country. And so people within that culture are required to wear the national dress. And in that case, it means that men are wearing white dish dashes most of the time, and women are wearing black abayas, and most of them with hijabs on, not all of them, but most of them with hijabs on, black again in general. This is when we started. I think things have evolved a little bit since then. But basically, when I went in to start to work, I was in that country, I was working primarily with the most senior women. And I was teaching the top 75 each month. I was working individually with the top 4 women. And I was doing some work separately with the most senior men as well. So it's kind of like a 3-pronged program. But the women, I was used to wearing kind of modest clothing and being conscious culturally of that norm. And I had asked a friend of mine who'd lived there for about 10 years, a man, do you think I should get an abaya before I start this work as a form of respect? And he said, no, don't do that. That could be seen as cultural appropriation. So don't go there. So I said, okay, fine. So I started to work with them. And almost immediately, I would say within 1 month, because I used to go 1 month for about a week. Within a month, I had probably 5 different women saying to me, you'd look so good in an abaya. I'd like to give you a gift of an abaya. Let's go shopping for an abaya. And I thought, five of these women had said this to me. And I thought, okay, I have to kind of listen to what they're saying. What does it actually mean? Is that they want me to be more compliant with their culture? Or in fact, what I realized was it was an invitation to be part of their club. They felt good with me. They liked me. They enjoyed the courses, and they wanted me to look like them and be part of that club. So in fact, I did go out and get an abaya and started to wear an abaya over my clothes, which is probably the most comfortable article of clothing I've ever bought in my life, and got compliments galore from both the women themselves as well as from local men. So that was a very interesting moment because I can imagine people listening to this might say, well, I wouldn't do that, and might have their reasons about why that wouldn't work for them. But I realized it was a way for the women to say, you're part of us and you don't look like us, and we want you to look like us, and so that we feel you're part of our group. So that was a really, really interesting and kind of pivotal moment, I would say, for me in this work.
It depends a lot on the country, I would say. And in the UAE, that is a fact because they are 10% of the population. So they're very country. And in the main cities like Abu Dhabi or Dubai, the majority of the population are expats, are people that are not Emiratis, and they want and are attached to their national dress as a way of identifying themselves and also unite in the way that they progress, what are their values and traditions. But Kuwait, for example, from my experience and what I learned being there, the same. Due to the historical difference, it was the most progressed country before the invasion in the Gulf, before Dubai came to be what it is today. In the 60s and 70s, Kuwait was already in the top of all the GCC countries, which are the Gulf Cooperation Council. And I was mesmerized to understand that, first of all, in Kuwait, they are not as minority in the population as in the Emiratis. They are not 10% of the population. They are half, let's say, right, of the population. So their presence is obvious in the country, that not necessarily they have to make a point with the national dress. Also, I would say that there is this difference of people using the abaya versus people not using the abaya, and the women who do not use it, I would say that are more not Western, because they can not wear abaya but still wear long skirts and long sleeves, right? So adhering to a code which is not written, but a modesty code there that is prevailing all over. But I would say that there are quite two kinds of, dressing codes for very open, modern, and let's go for it women that love fashion and dress the way they like. And others that do value tradition and will wear their black abayas every time. So I was confronted in one female only meeting where I was the only expat there, where one of the managers, Kuwaiti managers, female, that always used an abaya since her high school years, all right? When she was it was known that she was going to be appointed DCO, she posed a question to her closest liaisons, and I had the privilege to be there when she asked, well, should I now drop the abaya now that I will become DCO, since now I will be working more with Western people, other stakeholders, UK, United States, clients, and other oil companies. And I was very, very surprised that she would even consider that, dropping a tradition that she had carried for 30 years, possibly more, 40 years of her existence, because of work necessities, let's say. And I was, of course, in silence because it was not my place to express an opinion. And everybody said, no, you should keep doing keep being who you are and not change now, so that you show that it was just a facade. Not at all. You should keep doing that. And then she turned around and she asked me. And I was like in this difficult situation, trying to also be part of this coaching for her. And I told her, I think that would be a bold move. And I would not discard that you consider that and embrace a new attitude towards a new leadership role that you will have. But you have to balance what are your inner values versus your corporate tenure. And please think about how many more years you have, right, until retirement, so that if that is enough time for you to establish a new self in your leadership. And she took like a week to think about that. And I had the opportunity to meet again with her, or she called me by phone, I don't remember. And she expressed to me that, you know what, I'm going to keep my abaya. I have decided into maintaining the way I have been until today. It was also an interesting leadership experience for me. And I want to share with you, Liz, that in this national oil company in Kuwait, men will use the abayas when they have a formal event, no matter the rank. But when they become managers, as the manager will be the one that is more in contact with external stakeholders, they changed for a Western suit, generally. And if from manager they go for DCO, they go again for the national dress. So it was, a learning all along. And I would not like to finish this small segment about the cultural dressing and stuff without a mention to the Venezuelan style. Because I being, so many decades already in energy, I can tell you that there was a time where you could tell there were four oil companies in Venezuela that were the legacy of ExxonMobil, Shell, the Venezuelan oil companies, and a merge of many other smaller American companies. And at the time, they were called Lagoven, Maraven, Corpoven. So when we had these four merging to three, you could tell by looking at the suits of the men who was Lagoven. And I will tell you, black and very traditional dress with a red tie generally, that was Lagoven style. Maraven style was instead a checkered or blue suit with more informal ties, sometimes even without, but it was different. And instead, Corpoven button up shirts and slacks. So there was a distinctive way of wearing and walking the talk. If they were managers, they would dress in a certain way. So what I want to mean is that not necessarily you can tell that leadership imposes a way of dressing only in the Middle East. It happens everywhere else. I have seen in Venezuela women dressing with a tie and men's clothes,
Yeah.
implying that they wanted to go up the ladder faster than
Yeah.
other women that would not dare to wear men's clothes.
Indeed, I can say that the woman that was a deputy CEO that I was working with there, depending upon where she was, she would be wearing either an abaya or a Chanel suit. She was always extremely well put together, but that point about is this an internal set of meetings or indeed are we having guests externally that we want to kind of present our international face to, or we want to show them our national dress? So people are very thoughtful about the code switching and when they actually put on the suit, whether it's a Chanel suit or a kind of men's suit, and when they're actually wearing their traditional dress. So I think that point about authenticity is really important in this, and that is true for both men and women, and it's true in all sorts of situations. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what are the skills that one needs to actually develop in people moving into that CEO role. And certainly that kind of authenticity and code switching element of who do I need to be today? Who do I need to project today that is still authentically me? Because I'm aware that my audience is one or another. That's one element of it. Then there's pieces about I'm aware that the primary thing that happens when you move into a CEO role is that you're spending 50 to 60% of your day strategic influencing, usually up to the board or out to the external stakeholder population, whether that's investors, regulators, policymakers, the media, clients, etc. So there's a whole population of external stakeholders in large organizations that want to talk to the top person. So you're navigating the kind of decision making and influencing the decision making around all of that. And so that's a big piece of it. Navigating the media itself and media interviews is a whole other skill base, and I want to come back to that in a moment. But part of this is also about stepping into your power. So feeling confident and able to kind of turn on that strength when you want to and dial it back when the circumstances require. And even to get into the room, into that CEO position, you need sponsorship at the top. So it's about developing those relationships with key people to get up and be appointed and be supported in that role. And so these are kind of topics that I wanted to talk about as well. Now, Maria, you wanted to talk a little bit about accents.
Yes, because one of the skills that I learned with humbleness is about the accents. I cannot certainly avoid the fact that as soon as I say good morning, a native speaker would know that I am not from the US, native from Houston, Texas, not at all. I'm not from UK. So I have, dealt with accents all my life. Italian accent speaking Spanish, then Spanish accent speaking in English, Italian accent speaking in Arabic for some strange reason. I speak a little bit of Arabic and people were laughing that I was the only person in the company speaking Arabic with an Italian accent. Even if I was proud of that, There are certain subtleties that we need to coach the executives, and those are accents and languages. So, what doesn't happen in the UK or Australia or in the United States or Canada, where there is only one language, you may say, and there is no way of hide any messages among peers, right? Because everybody understands English. Does not happen in, for example, in the Middle East or in Venezuela for that matter. Because if you have your invitees or guests or partners or clients are Americans, you can always shift to Spanish or to Kuwaiti Arabic, okay, dialect, to quickly say something to your peer to accommodate the way that the conversation goes. So how do you coach and directly tell an executive when to do that and when not to do that? Because it generally can be taken it comes across very hard when people speaking another language in front of, what is the majority that speak English. And I still remember an opportunity when we were in a board of directors in Kuwait, and they were speaking in Arabic, and all of a sudden they shifted to English, and they say, I know that Mariangela can understand Arabic, but I want to be extra sure that she gets this point so that she can envision an implementation plan or something like that. Everybody shifted to English so that I could
Mm.
grasp it. But in my private coaching to them, I would then tell them that it was beneficial for them to initiate the meetings in Arabic, because also the people that were not high ranked perhaps did not master English to the perfection. And it
Right.
was good for them to liaise directly with them. And for people in Venezuela, many times here in the United States, I have been in meetings with executives that, of course, all of them speak English, except the 3 or 4 Venezuelans that we are in the room. And many times they tend to go into Spanish, and I have to take them apart when I have the opportunity to tell them, do not go into Spanish. But why? But why? And I would say, well, and this is a funny example. When you go to do a manicurist or pedicure, and you see that the ladies are talking and laughing, don't you feel that they are laughing about you, or that you did something wrong, or whatever? The same happens. When you don't
Sure.
understand at all the language, you always raise this kind of uncertainty. What was that about? The coaching about that is important. And I also had to tell some of these executives to engage privately in English lessons, etc.,
Yeah.
to master the skill even better because it was
Yeah.
important. Hasn't it happened to you?
Yes, I wanted to tell the story that we had flagged before, where I was working with an Italian CEO who was living in Dubai, and he was working for a UK listed organization. Because I am a native English speaker, we were doing some prep for him beginning to do media interviews and to do investor interviews. It was part of our preparation for him stepping up. And because he's Italian, frankly, the drink that goes in this cup is from his culture. He would call that drink espresso. And that's perfectly fine because he's correct. It's his drink. But I would say, and English speakers would say espresso. When you start to translate this to what might happen in a media interview or in an investor interview, where you expect things to happen, not expect them to happen. When you are using that EX start to words, it can confuse people who are native English speakers. And because his company was listed in the UK, I knew he had to actually sort of shift that. It was probably the most awkward conversation I ever had with him because no one had ever corrected his English before. And, it's not a nice thing when you think you're actually a fluent speaker in something to have one thing picked on and corrected. So it was super awkward. We were doing media prep with filming and everything. And I could tell he was very, very uncomfortable. Like all the rest of the work that we had done was nothing in comparison to getting him to say espresso as espresso or expression or expect. So it is really important, although it sounds like a really silly thing. It's important because you don't want investors and the media focused on your quote mispronunciation of a word as they see it rather than the content of what you're actually stating. So yes, that's
Yes.
definitely something that happened to me. I'm conscious of our time. We have, I think, about 5 or 10 more minutes. And what's the best use of the time for us today? I have a few ideas, but I wanted to ask you, Maria.
I think that perhaps I would like to talk a little bit in this multiculturalism about how fluent or how the acceptance of improvisation is in different cultures. I would consider that one of the things that are different, very basically different, in the Anglo-Saxon cultures and the Latin-based or Arabic cultures is the fluency with which they accept changes. Changes in the agenda, changes in the scheduling, changes at the last minute of things. And I will give you one example. And since you hit on the Italians, I'm gonna pick a French fellow example. And we have this very formal dinner where all after a conference, an international conference in Kuwait, where all the CEOs and distinguished personalities that were in the country were invited to attend. And there was this presidential table that was the epitome of elegance. I mean, it was the non plus ultra, that it was so pretty. And every place had the name of the people, no? As you very well said, royal family, CEOs, deputy CEOs, and the invitees from all the main companies. But this French CEO from a French company that was there, his name was not in the table and he refused to sit at the presidential table. So I was sent 3 times. First by the CEO of the company asking me privately why X guy was not sitting at the table. And I said, well, he's a little bit upset. Well, talk to him. You can make it happen. I said, okay, I will try. So I went there and I explained the situation. And he said, but I am as important as I, as important as Z. How come my name is not there? And I told him, listen, there is no relevance about that. I mean, things are done at the last minute and we can change. I mean, just please come. But he was very formal and he decided not to change the seats. Well, after 2, 3 months, because of the influence of the Kuwaiti people, he was demoted and they asked for another representation in the country. And to tell you the truth, I think that was right because you have to go with the flow. So I was, raised in Venezuela. I understand what happens in the different perception of what does it mean flexibility for an executive. But as it once happened to me in Nigeria, I was giving a distinguished lecture and they not only changed the venue, but the university where the lecture was going to be delivered. And I was only told in the morning by the driver, a very formal driver with uniform and all, so that they consider the presentation as important as to be given in another more important university, blah, blah, blah. So when I arrived, the vice president of the university introduced me in this huge auditorium. And he said, we are lucky that Dr. Mariangela is flexible. And he said this, and I quote, it's not my words. This is a word from an executive. He said, if she was an American, she would not have accepted this change because she would have requested to know where and when and how 6 months in advance. End of quote. So I pass it over to you, Liz.
So yeah, so I mean, as an American, I'll try not to take offense there. And I think what the international research in this area does show with people like Hofstede and Trompenaars, frankly, who've been doing research on national culture difference for since the 1960s in bulk, is that there are many different kind of like axes on which cultures differ, but definitely that flexibility one is an important one. And, there are cultures that are quite rigid. Probably the US is not renowned for that, but maybe some Germanic cultures or maybe some Asian cultures like Japanese culture, for example, are, where there's some of those kinds of sensitivities. But I do think, going back to our original conversation in the beginning of this, it's important to recognize that to be successful as an expat working within multiple cultures, you have to be flexible. Absolutely. And I'm keen actually to ask you a question where you were on the inside in the Kuwait situation and I was on the outside. But basically, as I understand it, the 10 global CEO coaches that you started with over the course of time dwindled down to 6 of us who kind of survived. So 40% were not able to make the grade. And I'm keen to understand why, because I suspect it has something to do with this topic.
Yes, and I think that first of all, there were several factors. Most importantly is to build trust immediately. They couldn't understand, the nationals, how come a person coming out of nowhere will tell them what to do or how to do it. So I think that some of them didn't take enough time to build trust, and that in a culture where trust is everything. I mean, you can seal big deals with a handshake. Well, actually, not a handshake if you're a woman, but okay, you got the point. On the word, right, of the person, not a signed contract. So in that region of the world, you needed to build trust with time and techniques to do that as a coach. And the second thing is that some of the deputy CEO perhaps realized they didn't have enough, I would say, courage and commitment to engage in the profound transformation that the coaching process entails. And they let it go because they were not supportive of a critique process that would then lead to major changes in what is a prestige, a behavior, or perhaps also a style of leadership that they wanted to continue. So some of the transformations that the coaches were trying to achieve were maybe too aggressive, okay? And coming
I see.
from an American perspective or a UK perspective,
Right.
where most of them
Right.
were from, where they came across as aggressive.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's that, in a way, it was that kind of sense of my culture is right, you're wrong.
Yeah.
I'm going to make you be like the people that I know in my place who are successful leaders.
Yes. And
Right.
in a way, there is this on their script, if you may,
Uh-huh.
a non-written script where you praise the leading nations of the world, but in a country that is still developing, you have this kind of reticence to accept that you cannot be in the top for many reasons. So there is this feeling of jealousy, curiosity, animosity, and I would say also skepticism about any coach that would come from a leader country coaching people that come from a society that is developing.
Hmm.
So this gap could or not be closed by coaching because it's an existing gap that is there. And remember the story of colonialism that prevails in many of the countries towards the south of the in the southern hemisphere, if you may.
Yeah.
I think that is a good way to perhaps going towards the closure of this second podcast. The title was How to Thrive in a New World. And what we wanted to do is to share some anecdotes, some tips, and summarize what is needed, not only to be a coach, but to accept coaching to become CEO. Remember, our podcast is about becoming CEO. That can be summarized into two words: courage and humbleness.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in our third podcast. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you to our listeners for paying attention.